But like find a way so it's comfortable for you. I know in the first row it's sort of hard to see sometimes. This lecture. The last one on a syntax approach. So you remember we talked about the formal approach where we looked at X-bar theory, then a functional approach, systemic functional grammar, which we'll quickly review today just to sort of recap what we talked about before Christmas. And then today the cognitive approach, sort of as an approach to studying syntax, and then more specifically cognitive grammar and a little bit on construction grammar as well, because they also grew out of each other and they interact a lot and they inform each other as well. So, just to remind you, systemic functional grammar is very much a theory or an approach that deals with context a lot. So, meaning has to do with our background knowledge, with what culture I come from, which culture I interact in, and also the situation I'm actually in. Oh, okay, they all come individually. No, we don't need that. So there is extra-linguistic context and linguistic context, so the actual situation and my background, but also the things in the text, so to speak. And from this, they arrive at 3 meta-functions. So they say there are 3 parameters of context. There is the mode, so what's actually in the text there, the field, what I bring with me, my culture, my experience, and the tenor, so what interpersonal elements are sort of going on between us, and those, they have to do with the meta-functions a text then fulfills. So the situation that I have and what I bring with it and how I structure it goes into the text. This is realized in the text. So from this we have these 3 meta-functions, the textual meta-function, the ideational meta-function, and the interpersonal meta-function, dealing with different kind of context and different things that I want to bring into the text. So what's crucial about this is that first I have certain functions I want to realize, certain things I want to encode and bring into my communication. And this depends a lot on context. And then I produce the text. So it starts in the mind and goes into the text. It's not in the text itself. The 3 meta-functions we discussed were ideational, interpersonal, and textual, as I said. So the ideational refers to the experiences in the world that I have, and this is what I then encode in language. So there is a sort of extra-linguistic reality that I've experienced and that I've logically deduced from my experiences, and that's what I then encode. But there are also things that I say or write because I'm communicating between 2 specific people or a group of people where our relationship is also encoded, and where I as a person and the difference in hierarchy or age or whatever else, or how close we know each other, comes into play. And these are the interpersonal meta-functions. And then we have the textual ones that have to do with how we organize a text, and that again has to do to an extent with our experiences. So how do we expect a certain text to be built up? How does the text itself interlink? Now, so we're going down one level after the other. So ideational meta-functions in more specific way, we said we have processes, participants, and circumstances. 3 types of processes. There can be material processes, things that we do that sort of actually interact with the material world in a way. Relational ones, so I have 2 things that I set into a relation. If I say, I am a lecturer, I am a woman, I have these 2 elements that I put into relation to each other. And then I have projecting processes, like I say and I think, where this entire propositional content is sort of put out there. You can have different participants, like the actor, the goal, and so on and so forth, and the circumstances when, where, and how something happened. And all these are the different ideational meta-functions. There are also interpersonal ones. The two that we have discussed so far is what kind of interaction is it? So am I giving information or am I demanding them? And what is my stance? So what is my position as a speaker? And to an extent, of course, what I expect from my addressee also comes into play here to that propositional content I am communicating, as well as the attitude. And then we said the third meta function, and here I just want to draw your attention to something because it might be a little bit confusing. We said there's a theme usually, or always actually, and a reme. So I always start out with something that I then comment on. And this distinction, we say we draw the line at the point where the first ideational function comes up. That's where I distinguish between the whole theme and the whole reme. Now, within the whole theme, I can have different kinds of themes. So themes within themes, so to speak. So if I have, like here, a textual theme, this whole thing is the theme of the sentence, therefore the critics praised him incessantly. Because we said the first ideational function, so the first participant, process, or circumstance, which here is the critics, or participants. But before that, I have something else. So the whole thing is my theme. This would be the first topical theme, but the first theme of the sentence really organizes the text. It tells you this sentence and that sentences are linked. And what kind of link is it? It's a causal link, and thus I use the word therefore. This is what therefore encodes. But therefore gives me textual information. And the first topical information, the first topical theme is the critics. So two themes that together form the theme of the sentence, and here I have my reme. So just to sort of sum that up, we have the three parameters of context. Each of them have a meta function assigned to them. So this kind of context brings this kind of function to the actual text. And then we have the different types that go with the different functions. Any questions on this? This is sort of the fast-forward version of what we did last time. And this is also just to remind you, in 2 weeks' time we'll have a question session. So if you read up on this and study this over the next week or so, and you realize, this is something we should cover in more detail, please enter that on the Moodle platform, because then we can prepare properly for the last session, and it's not an awkward, any questions? No, yes, okay, we're going to go home kind of thing. So if you do that, it really, really helps me. Oh, and also Ms. Puffer, of course. Okay, so functional approach, done with that. And we'll move towards the cognitive approach. And what you have to realize, just to remind you, is that both of them sort of grew out of the formal approach. So many of the people who coined and phrased and brought up and developed these, the functional and the cognitive approach were originally students of Chomsky and were raised in this generative tradition, but were frustrated with this idea that form is the priority, generating all possible, acceptable grammatical sentences, but none that aren't, is the focus. That's something they were not happy with. They said meaning is somewhere else. So both of them, in a way, are reactions to the formal approach, to formal theories, and they seem to have more tenets that they share than they both share with generative grammar. So sometimes it's hard to distinguish with certain people, are you more of a functionalist or more of a cognitivist? Because many of the basic ontological assumptions regarding like how does language actually work are the same. But again, they focus on different things. So functionalists obviously on functional elements, and the cognitive approach, as we'll see in a minute, a lot on how we structure things in our minds. The idea being, and if you remember your Ogden-Richards triangle and the whole reference thing, that we don't refer in our language to things in the world, but to how we conceptualize these things in our mind. So meaning is not out there, meaning is primarily, or I would even say only, what I have in my mind, what I as a speaker, or we as a speech community seem to be constructing together in our minds, and that is where meaning is located. and thus cognitive, more than, okay, what does every bit function as, which would be functional. So today's program then in detail is the cognitive paradigm a little bit. There are two principles that we'll discuss, some main areas, and then the concept of a form meaning pairing. And then, so that's the approach, one specific theory, cognitive grammar, mostly developed by Ronald Langacker, but many people have added to that, and construction grammar in a way developed out of that, and we'll also look at this. There are some basic concepts that we'll cover, like construal, perspective, foregrounding frame, and the concept of fuzzy categories, which I'm sure you're familiar with, maybe from language analysis, maybe also from your semantics lessons. And then one topic that will apply all these to is the concept of spatial meanings, mostly because this is something cognitive grammar has studied extensively and where you can illustrate many concepts. But cognitive grammar has not only done that. I sometimes feel we convey this impression because that's what we focus on, but you can find cognitive grammar studies and articles on all kinds of linguistic topics. And the same goes for number 4. Okay, numbering is a challenge. The meaning extensions, the metaphor theory that also grew out of cognitive grammar. So, as I said, Langacker, in his 1987 book, which is part 1 of what he put forth as in a 2-part book on cognitive grammar, calls the following thing the cognitive paradigm. The most fundamental issue in linguistic theory is the nature of meaning and how to deal with it. I take it as self-evident that meaning is a cognitive phenomenon and must eventually be analyzed as such. Cognitive grammar therefore equates meaning with conceptualization. What that is in essence means is what I said before, that everything I put into a sentence or in utterance or whatever mostly has to do with, or how I do that has to do with how I structure things in the mind. So, for example, I would probably say this desk is behind me, and you would probably say this desk is in front of you, because you have a different perspective on this. This is one way of talking about it. But many things have different ways that we could address them as, and we choose which ones we actually bring into the sentence. So if I was to describe this lecture room, I would probably mention the chairs, I would maybe mention how it's, what the lighting conditions are like. I might mention that it's steep, that it's on an incline, I would mention the projector. But this is a choice. Of course, I could go into details of what the brown on the chairs, on the chair's front is different from the brown on the chair sides. I could go into detail on the access and mobility stickers, on all these things. But I pick out, in my description, I pick out certain things. And that's where cognitive grammar says meaning is essentially located. Because I find some elements meaningful, and social practice also tells us that they are sharedly perceived as meaningful, and others not. So you would be very surprised if you asked me out there, okay, so what's the lecture room like? And they said, well, there is different kinds of gray stones on the floor. And it would be weird, right? But if we were, I don't know, the people who have to refurnish the whole thing, and we were picking out floors, and this was our topic, then it wouldn't be weird. So conceptualization also has to do with where is my viewing frame? What am I actually looking at in describing it? And this is what they mean by conceptualization. So I am aware of many things, but I only pick out certain things. And we also have to establish those meaningful categories in our minds. So I, not trained in floor furnishing, wouldn't know what to call these things. There are certain categories I wouldn't even be aware of, because that's not my field of expertise, so I haven't been trained to have this category in our mind. This also relates back to, for example, what we talked about in phonology with minimal pairs. If my experience doesn't find the distinction between the and w meaningful, like German speakers do or don't, then it's very hard for me to even pick out the fact that vampire and vampire is not the same thing. But once you have learned this category as meaningful, you have it in your mind, you have this conceptualization of it in your mind, and then you notice the difference. But you need this category in your mind to really be aware of it, and many language learners say, I don't hear the difference, and get very frustrated with us teachers, for example. So the basic reality in the world that I say veil and whale, and it's two different things, that is stable. I can say veil and whale, but it takes the category of w in my students' minds for them to even hear it. And that is what cognitive grammar means. It's not a question of what's out there in the world. It's a question of what is in our mind and how do we structure and how do we organize meaning in our minds. We are adding things here. Yeah. Evans and Green wrote a textbook on cognitive grammar, a very hefty, lengthy one, but very approachable on the other hand. And they phrase it a little bit differently. They say, so an important reason behind why cognitive linguistics study language stems from the assumption that, an important reason behind why cognitive linguists study language stems from the assumption that language reflects patterns of thought. Sort of the more patterned version of what I just explained. Therefore, to study language from this perspective is to study conceptualizations. So how do I look at things? Language offers a window into cognitive function, providing insights into the nature, structure, and organization of thought. So they take it a step further. They don't only say, okay, we seem to be we organize things in our minds in a certain way, and thus we use language in this way. But then they go on to say, okay, and the language use we see, therefore must be reflecting what's going on in our mind. Now this is a little bit circular in a way, right? And I can easily say that because cognitive linguists are aware of this fact, but they also feel that this is all we have to go on. We assume that it makes sense that our language, a very sort of human experience strongly linked to cognition, is structured in the way that reflects cognition, and therefore from one we can draw conclusions on the other. But they're also aware of the fact that they don't really know, so they try to also build on evidence from neurolinguistics and psycholinguistics. Psycholinguistics, especially neurolinguistics, is just a later field. We don't have quite as many clear results from it as we would often wish. And the idea is that cognitive linguists sort of propose hypotheses. They're the theory makers. And then they hope that people who have access to patients or participants or study setups and even machinery, that they would then test the hypotheses that cognitive linguists put forth. Okay. So, to sum that up, or also to bring back some ideas we've already covered. So cognitive linguistics, it's a break from the generative tradition, also in the sense that it's non-modular. So let's remember we said there are sort of, in many descriptions of linguistics, 4 modules: the phonology, morphology, semantics, and syntax model. And generative grammar primarily looks at syntax. So they say, okay, you can study this module syntax on its own. You can look at certain lists of words and certain grammatical elements. So we have this distinction between lexical elements and grammatical elements. And if I know all the lists of words and if I know all the rules of the language, I can sort of put them together like a good Lego box and make sentences. So I'm looking at syntax on its own. Cognitive grammar, or within the cognitive paradigm, you would say that no, this doesn't work. You can never look at syntax without also looking at semantics, and semantics is also influenced by the morphemes that sort of come into play there, and word formation processes, and phonology takes a role, because I can encode a question syntactically, but I can also encode a question phonologically, and you cannot look at one without looking at all the others. So definitely non-modular. In cognitive linguistics, meaning is seen as conceptual, as we said, and also it's not compositional, but holistic. So a word or a sentence is not made up of this idea of, okay, here I have my lexical elements, then I stick some morphemes to it, and the entire meaning of the sentence is only the sum of its component parts. The idea is that anything put together from any two elements is always more than the two elements, in the sense that this new construction is used in a specific context by specific people and takes on a specific meaning by its use. So there is more to, whatever, a door handle than just, okay, it's a door and it's got a handle, because we have experiences with door handles as such. And door handle as such, like sort of goes through language and is used in certain constructions but not in others, and it takes on these elements. So there must be more to it than just this combination. So the meaning of a sentence is not just the sum of the separate sentences, no matter how, and then bringing into terms here, analyzable or compositional it is. Yeah.
When you say there's more than like the door and the handle, that, for example, if I could say, I got caught by the door handle, maybe my clothes stuck to the door handle, for people to understand what I'm doing, so the door handle usually cannot catch somebody?
In a way, because it goes beyond the function that you would then presume. So handle and door together would only imply this idea of opening, but it gives it a different function. Although I think cognitive grammarians would have more to say on the example of a door handle catching you, and we'll cover that in a bit. But yes, that comes into play. Now, door handle, we would say, is compositional, composed of sort of two elements. And we also immediately analyze it as such. So if I say door handle, you're probably aware of the fact that it's made up of those two things. But there are also elements that are completely compositional, but you don't immediately analyze them. Like, for example, the word triangle. We're all aware of the fact that it's three angles, this sort of angle between two sides. But if I think triangle, I do not analyze it into these bits. I treat the whole thing as one unit, right? So I can analyze it, but it's not analyzable in this very intuitive sense. And there are also constructions that are analyzable only in a historic way, like the cranberry morphemes we talked about, where you have to know that it used to be a crane, berry, in order to analyze it. But you can clearly also say it's definitely compositional. It's composed of two things, but with those blocked morphemes, those unique morphemes, we have troubles analyzing it. So even if something is completely compositional and analyzable, it does more than just its component parts would do. Oh yeah, and obviously it rejects the idea of a universal grammar and a language faculty that only works for language. So language learning in cognitive grammar is not this idea that I have my principles in my mind and I'm born with it, and my language acquisition device has all these principles of, is there a subject or not, is there double negation or not, all these elements, and then by a little bit of input, I set my parameters. The idea of cognitive grammar is that we learn it just as we learn anything else. That learning is, and that's the term they would use, a domain general process. So it's not something restricted to the domain of language, but we do learn a lot of very complex things as toddlers or young adults later on and everything that seem to go beyond what we should be able to learn. Generative grammarians would often argue that there's a poverty of stimulus. So from the little bit that children get, from the mistakes parents make, from the sort of also child-directed input that they get, they shouldn't be able to abstract language. Now, generative grammarians would say, well, but we do that with so many things. I mean, it might be a mysterious process that we don't fully understand, but we learn so many complex things. And an example I'd like to give regarding this is from The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, where you have a teacher who tries to, so he sets his students an assignment saying, I have a spherical or almost spherical object of about 10 centimeter in diameter, and I have a catapult that has 2 movable angles that shoots with this and that strength in that direction. Where exactly will that spherical object land? And the students start calculating and thinking, and after quite a while they cannot figure it out. And then he whistles and calls in the kitchen boy, takes an apple and tosses it, and of course the kitchen boy catches the apple. So despite the fact that the process of not even a round object that is thrown by something that really doesn't even work in a one-angle catapult because you have 3 different joint elements here, and takes a curve that I couldn't calculate, despite all these facts, I have the ability to catch the apple. So we do learn extremely complex processes without having all these structured knowledge about it, without needing a lot of input and practice. You don't stand for years and years. People learn to catch a ball at a very young age, and it is an extremely complex process. And here we're just talking about catching a ball. Think of music, think of playing a piano, think of dancing. We do learn very complex things on the basis of very little, and the idea is that we do it in a way that is similar for different things. So it's not a unique thing for language that we can learn something as awesome and complex. Yeah. 2 basic assumptions, basically covered that. So structure reflects cognition, and language is non-modular. This non-modularity also implies that just as learning is domain general, many principles apply to many different things. So it's not like phonology works completely different from morphology or anything else, which brings in this idea that, so we talked about fuzzy categories in semantics, but grammar in cognitive grammar is considered very meaningful and equally fuzzy. So it's not just semantics that has its issues, and generative grammar often says, okay, we're not dealing with semantics because we want straightforward rules and categories. But then cognitive grammar comes and says, yeah, grammar is also fuzzy. And we'll return to that in a bit. So rules like fuzziness, like prototype theory, or I'm saying rules, processes, ideas, they apply to many different modules. They're organized in a similar way. Cognitive grammar has 2 key commitments. I'll start with the second one, actually, because we've touched upon this. Cognitive grammar says, cognitive paradigm, I'm sorry, I keep saying cognitive grammar because that's what I worked in most, but different cognitive approaches. In the cognitive paradigm, you would say that there is a commitment to the characterization of general principles of language that is in accordance with what is known about the mind and brain from other disciplines. So as I said, they don't necessarily say, okay, this is exactly what's going on in your mind, but they say this is a decent hypothesis, this accounts for what we know, but if there is any evidence from other disciplines that contradicts it, then we need to change our theory. So they want to be cognitively real, but at the same time they're very aware of the fact that we don't quite know. And so we put our hypotheses out there and say, okay, let's test them. And if we need to adapt our theory, sure, fine, let's do that. And the generalization commitment is a commitment to the characterization of general principles that are responsible for all aspects of language. So non-modularity, we do it all in a very similar way. There are 2 main areas in the cognitive paradigm. The one being cognitive semantics, where they investigate relationships between experience, the conceptual system, and semantic structures encoded by language. And then the approaches to grammar more specifically, although of course they're extremely linked in cognitive grammar. And the 2 theories we look at today is cognitive grammar, mainly developed by Langacker, and construction grammar, of which there are different kinds, from more radical to less so. The kind we discuss a lot today is Goldberg, but also Filmer and Kay. Croft would be the more radical version, very interesting also to read up on. Yeah, cognitive semantics forms the basis of cognitive grammar. So since we said it's the same kind of processes for all domains and for all modules anyways, what we take from semantics we can also apply to grammar. Very important is the centrality of meaning then. So not only semantics is the study of meaning in the sense of lexical semantics, but grammar is meaningful. On a more abstract level, sure, but it does carry some kind of meaning. So if I have a sentence like the child has been sleeping all day, when we did morphology, we said, okay, here are the lexical elements, child and sleep and day, and here are the functional elements, the, has, been, ing, all. And we had this strict division. Now cognitive grammarians would say, but wait a minute. The, doesn't that carry a sort of meaning? When do we use it? Well, we use it when there's an assumed identifiability. So I, as a speaker, assume that you know what child I'm talking about. Now, this is information. This is not empty. This is a way of encoding meaning. Because what it means is there is this identifiability to the next element in my sentence. And what is that but meaning? So all of these have a highly schematic, but nevertheless a kind of meaning. And that doesn't only work on the word level, like here with this free morpheme, but also on a sentence level or a construction level. So it's not only the words that fill a subject position, a verb position, an object position, but there's meaning to the entire thing in a way. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. This meaning has a one-to-one relationship. So one form has one meaning. So if I have a new form, there must be a difference in meaning. There are no transformations then, like in generative grammar where we said Jane wrote the book was written by Jane. In terms of reference to the world, yes, that's the same meaning. And generative grammar would say, okay, these are two transformations of the same deep structure. And what I firstly have in my mind is the deep structure. Cognitive grammarians would say, wait a minute, I'm selecting different things here. I'm conceptualizing the situation differently. I'm starting out with the book. This is sort of my theme. This is what I'm commenting on. And I'm not starting out with the person. And with the book was written, I could even leave out by Jane. So these are two different conceptualizations in my mind. And if meaning is my conceptualization in my mind, then these have two different meanings because they assign different roles in a different order. Something else is going on there. So one form has one meaning. And there is no transformation between one meaning that, so there's not one meaning that can take two different forms. If there are two different forms, they will be competing historically for a while. I mean, that would be a different theory really, but the idea being that even if I do have two forms, they will quickly, because they'll be used differently, develop two different meanings. They will grow apart. Like when you look at the German, ich habe gelesen und ich las, the perfect and the preterite, in terms of reference to the world, they encode the same thing. But they've taken on two different roles. They have two different functions, and thus, because they're used in different situations, they carry different meaning. The basic unit, in terms of our meaning analysis in cognitive grammar, is a construction. And the often quoted sentence is, constructions go all the way down. So from the smallest meaningful unit up to basically a text or anything, it's constructed, it's built up, and every unit has meaning, and every larger unit has a meaning that is more than its component parts. It inherits the meaning though. So if I have the door handle inherits the meaning from door and handle, but it's more than just this. And if I have the door handle, the old door handle, the old door handle here, the door handle caught my sleeve, I built up constructions. Everything's a construction, sort of. Every unit that we can identify, from a morpheme to a word, to a phrase, to a sentence, to a whatever. So we do away with all these words. Again, we say, okay, there is no modularity. All the things, or many of the things, apply on all levels. So then let's just look at it and say, okay, they also are all the same. They're all all constructions, and things apply on all levels of construction. If we take that to the extreme, which I guess cognitive grammar to an extent does, we do away with this distinction between lexicon and grammar completely. Because if everything applies to everything, if we say grammar has meaning, if we acknowledge things that are somewhere between the grammar-lexicon continuum, like many of us have been struggling with the suffix "ly", because in a way it adds grammatical information, but in a way it adds lexical information, so what is it really? Then we say there is a climb. Some things seem to be rather, or behave in a way that we would classify as lexical. Some things are extremely schematic, do certain things that we say are rather grammatical, and in between I have a cline, and all things are somewhere on there. So I might still talk about a grammatical elements if it's extremely grammatical, or a lexical one if it's extremely lexical, but the boundary is very fuzzy. Things can move along that boundary, so really there is no clear distinction between a lexicon and our grammar. There's a continuum between them. Let's look at some examples then. If we say a sentence, a construction has meaning. So I have Sue pushed the pram up the hill, and John handed the keys to his father. Have a quick chat with your neighbor. Is there something that sort of ties these two sentences that have completely different lexical elements together? And could you identify something that sort of then underlies them, in your opinion? So what's going on here? What do I have in the beginning of both of them? Yeah, you have an agent. You have a someone, and then I have a verb, yes. And this verb, what do both of them have in common? It's the same kind of process, yes. So pushing and handing, both of them have this idea of moving something somewhere else. And both of them are conceptualized as being in the past here, right? So someone moves something, then we have a something, then we have sort of a direction and where it goes. And I could have you now come up with many, many sentences that follow the same pattern. Now, the idea in construction grammar and also cognitive grammar is that lexical elements are more concrete than grammatical elements, if we make this distinction. So you have these lexical items, and they primarily, in a historical sort of way, contributed to the meaning of such a sentence. But over time, with similar things filling these slots, the slots themselves took on this meaning. So this sort of a plubi, knoop, a schnoop, schnoop, ribidi, boom, boom, has the same pattern and has the same structure and conveys this meaning, even if what I fill in is complete nonsense, complete like nonce words like I created now. Now, with complete nonce words, it becomes very difficult, but it's easy to see that I can substitute certain elements, certain slots within the construction. So if I accept that we say, okay, this is an agent sort of moved a patient to a new goal construction, then I can also fill in other things here, or here, or here, even unexpected ones. And I'm jumping ahead a little here. If you think of the word, for example, chest, like, yeah, human body part, what word class would you say that is? It's a noun. Would we say it's a prototypical noun, a good noun, or is it more like run, where I can have a run, but I can also say I run a mile or something? Or would you say chest is a typical noun? You wouldn't say it's a very fuzzy one, right? Nevertheless, I can easily say I chested my way through the crowd. Or, and this is from sports, Ferguson's cross was chested over the line by Johnson. And we understand these. Because this construction, agent, moved, something, somewhere, takes on this meaning. And then anything, or almost anything, can go into that slot and take on this bit of meaning that is provided by the construction. Are you with me on that? Cool. So that is the idea then, that it's not the way we're often taught in valence grammar, Satellitgrammatik, also in German, that which generative grammar would claim that I have a verb, and there are transitive verbs and ditransitive verbs and intransitive verbs. They have a certain structure, and it's the verb that determines how many elements I can have. But they would say it's the other way around. First, I look at a situation, or I imagine a situation in my mind. I pick out the elements that I think are salient. So I conceptualize it in a certain way. Then I choose the construction that can hold all the elements, and then I fill it with the lexical things that I want to go in there. And if the lexical one doesn't really prototypically go in that slotting grammar, then it will take on that meaning, because the construction has taken on the meaning. Okay? So, yeah. Then we, yeah.
So does it mean that they think if the lexical content is not clear enough about what it means, the grammatical structure kind of supports the conversion of the meaning?
Cannot or can? What did you say? Can. Yes.
The structure is basically, because if the lexical information is clear, nobody would think about what position can fulfill what meaning, but what is coming out to feel like chested. It's not a prototypical verb.
Yeah, but it's not restricted to that. It's sort of like the lexical items contribute meaning, and the structure contributes meaning, and a lot of time you have a double coding, so both of them contribute the same kind of meaning. But if it at some point is not the case, that's no problem, because the grammar can give context, can frame the meaning of the verb, or the whatever other word. Okay? And this example from Goldberg has often been used to illustrate this, that it would be, if you take a cognitive approach and adhere to these principles, probably seem a bit ridiculous that the word cooks, or cook, which can be intransitive, Pat cooks, or monotransitive, Pat cooked the steaks, but also you can have a copular construction, Pat cooked the steaks, well done, but I can also even have an unexpected agent, the chicken cooked all night, or I can say Pat cooked her way into the Illinois State Bake-Off. All these different constructions, all these different valencies, that they would all be stored with the verb cook. But that's what cognitive grammarians and construction grammarians would claim. It's more likely that we have this kind of combination. We have certain constructions and we have certain verbs or certain words in general, and they go into different slots. And depending on what slots they fill, they take on different meaning in that situation. Okay? So no verb valency thing, but construction carries the meaning. And these are the two examples from PNC we've covered. So, if in construction grammar the construction itself has meaning, what that of course means is that each of those constructions now gets a name. And that is a bit, that's going to extremes sometimes. So that's where it becomes difficult to keep track. Then if we say, okay, this, like the one we discussed, Sue pushed the pram up the hill, that's the English caused motion construction, because you have a causer, you have a patient, and you have a goal. X causes Y to move Z. Then this is the caused motion construction. And the I cooked my way into the Illinois Bake-Off contest would be the way into construction. So every sort of construction gets its own name, which of course we're not consciously aware of. It's not like we store these constructions like lists and then we fill them. What happens is that by patterned usage, we attach these meanings to the constructions on a rather subconscious level. So this is different to the compositional approach because the number and type of arguments, so my subjects, objects, complements, etc., are not determined by the verb, but by the construction. The speaker chooses the construction in response to the conceptualization. And there's more to this than just the component parts because it's always used in that function. So even if I take some component parts out, the construction retains the meaning and other elements can go in there. And they bring a lot of evidence for this, lots of these sentences that they put in contrast. Like, the classic thing would be, George knocked the vase off the table. But I can also have things like, George sneezed the napkin off the table. And it's our world knowledge that sneeze sort of has this movement of air, but it's not in the verb sneeze that it can go into the construction, but there's this caused motion construction. And because we have world knowledge about sneezing, we realize that actually, yeah, sneeze can go into this construction because it can fulfill this caused motion thing. It's not a rule that is attached to the word sneeze. It's something that has to do with the construction and our world knowledge about sneezing. And these are things that we couldn't account for in a compositional approach because sneeze doesn't carry that kind of meaning if you go with a complete list of lexical item approach. Similar things can be said about George coaxed Lily under the sofa. So under is usually a stative preposition, right? I say, I don't know, it's under the table. But because of the meaning of coax and the construction, under can actually take on this movement. And the same happens, of course, with in, into, on, onto. Usually we used to say that, or we claim that there's a grammatically clear category of, I don't know, the flash drive is in my hands and I put it into my hands. But when you look at actual language use, lots of people say I poured it in the glass, or I put it in the glass, or I put it in my hand. Because this construction has the caused motion, so I don't necessarily need the information of the caused motion from the preposition, so in or under can then fulfill this function. Yeah. So this was a lot of construction grammar, and now a bit more on cognitive grammar in particular. Sorry? Yeah. Okay. So in the traditional approach that we've discussed before, we said the rule of language is to describe the external world, and this is done by direct mapping. So each part in the external word corresponds to a particular linguistic form, and a complex construction is then the sum of all these component things that I've put together. So then John gave Mary the book, and John gave the book to Mary would have the same meaning. They're just different surface constructions of the same thing. In cognitive grammar, as I said, we say one form, one meaning. So two forms then have two different meanings. So we must be doing something differently here. We must look at the same external situation in a different way. And this idea of looking at it in a certain way that depends on how I position myself and many, many other things, that's what we call construing. So how do I conceptualize, how do I construe a situation matters. So John gave the book to Mary and John gave Mary the book are two different encodings of two different construals, two different ways of looking at the same situation. Therefore, in a way, they encode two different meanings. Evidence from that we usually draw from the fact that not everything lends itself to this. So I can say John gave Mary a hug, but I cannot really say John gave a hug to Mary And it becomes even clearer when I look at John gave the fence a new coat of paint, but John gave a new coat of paint to the fence is much rarer. And to look at the other example, he brought the wine to the table works, but he brought the table the new wine is rather odd. So how come this transformation, as generative grammarians would say, doesn't work for all sentences? Well, cognitive grammarians would say, well, the A constructions imply transfer, whereas the B ones are caused motion. So there is a difference between those two. For the B ones, I sort of have a path, and A only focuses on the new possessor. And this is the difference between those two meanings, and some things cannot be possessed. So I cannot, some things don't really move along a path, for example. I cannot say that this giving a hug, that's not the same kind of path as bringing a wine. So this is the difference we try to make here. Construal may be due to many different things, or differences in construal. Often it's a question of perspective. Like I said, sort of, is this table behind you or in front of you? I can say the path falls steeply into the valley, but I can also say the path climbs steeply out of the valley. Same situation in the world, but I've chosen to take a different perspective. Or George smashed the vase was smashed by John. Again, it's a question of what do I conceptualize as the more salient part, or what do I conceptualize as the theme, and it sort of gives you a different perspective. And some of them really can illustrate the difference. Like I can say John resembles Mary, and Mary resembles John. Same situation in the world. But this kind of change doesn't work for everything. I can say, okay, I don't know, Larry really resembles her mom, but her mom really resembles Larry is odd. So it must be clear that there is one reference point that sort of provides reference for the other, and you cannot just exchange them. And it becomes clearest with John bought the car from Mary, Mary sold the car to John. We said buy and sold. If you think back to semantics, what's the relationship between buy and sell? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What kind of semantic relationship is between those two? Just a bit of a recap from your semantics lesson. Would you say it's a synonym, an antonym, a hyponym, or no relation at all? It's an antonym, yes. What kind of antonym? I don't know if anyone remembers. If one implies the other necessarily, then it's a converse. Yeah, sorry, you were going to say that, right? Yeah, it's not gradable, definitely, but it's also a converse. If I am a seller, then there has to be a buyer. I cannot be a seller without there being a buyer. I actually also cannot be a lecturer without students. I'm very glad that so many of you actually did show up now. So, John needs Mary in this respect, and Mary needs John. Same situation in the world, but different viewpoint. Different way of construing the situation, and that becomes especially clear if I, for example, add for a good price. Because what is a good price for John, who bought the car, is not a good price for Mary, who sold the car, right? So clearly here we can see that it is a difference in meaning. It's a difference in perspective. Yeah. And this idea of reference point comes up a lot in cognitive grammar, also in the form of there being a landmark and a trajectory. Because I usually look at one element, the trajectory, in terms of another, my landmark. So the thing that's usually more important to me, or that I want to comment on, or that I want to do something with, I need to identify for my addressee, and therefore put it into relation with something that we both know, that's usually larger, that's very salient and stable, and that's the landmark for my trajectory. It will become clear in a second, if it's not. So, let's say there's a house and there's a hill, and you have this situation. You would probably describe it as the house is on the hill. You probably wouldn't say the hill is under the house, although both are unarguably true. But the house is the thing that I care about, that I want to be talking about. It's the smaller entity. It's, in terms of like historical development, the more movable entity. And there's a hill that's stable, so I give you this in reference to that. So hills are more natural reference points than houses. But of course, if I look at another entity, if I look at the car, which is even more movable, which is even smaller, which is more likely to change place, then I would probably locate the car as the car is in front of the house, rather than the house is behind the car. So here, house suddenly is the more natural reference point. So it's always a question also of gradients and of comparison to something else. And this is not stable. I mean, in theory, I could say the house is behind the car. Let's say we're very, very far away from my house, and you're asking me, where do you live? I said, well, my house, it's somewhere there, sort of behind the car. Because the house is so far in the distance, it becomes this small entity. This is also the thing that we both sort of talk about, and the car is right here. We can see it, it can function as a good reference point. So the perspective that I take there has the car dominant and present, and the house small and somewhere far away as a sort of movable entity, because we need to place it, we need to locate it. So it's not inherent to the things we talk about, it's not inherent to the situation in the world, it's just a matter of how I conceptualize it. Okay? So you have this notion, also just to illustrate this here, you would probably talk about the two birds in the sky. So birds then is the trajectory, and the sky is my landmark. But here I could say, well, I just see a little bit of sky behind the two birds. And then here the sky would be the trajectory, and the two huge birds would be the landmark. The difference that I have between those two is an adjustment in viewing frame. So here my frame is bigger, and here I have a very narrow frame that gives the more prototypical landmark sky less space, and this is just the bigger entity, yeah.
But the birds become the landmark only if I say the sky behind the birds.
Mm-hmm.
It's the opposite if we say the birds in the sky.
Well, in both cases, from where we're standing, the sky is behind the birds, isn't it?
Yes. But why is it just about what is the main focus of what we're trying to say?
It is to an extent that. So there's many things that come into play here. The one is, what is my focus? The other one is, what is easier identifiable for us as a group than what is more movable? So many different things come into play when it comes to what do I conceptualize as the smaller movable entity that needs to be located in terms to something, and what is the thing that I can actually use for locating. So there's no clear-cut answer to your question, I think. It's not only that. So there are things like, what did we have? Yeah, it's hard to say, but there are some things that really lend themselves better than others. I'll come back to it if I think of a good example, okay? Yeah, so construal, that's what we call this sort of perspective taking, can depend on the foreground, which is the most important salient participant, like in the birds. And sometimes what happens is, if I talk about street, it can be, in a way, different things, although the meaning is always the same. So I can say, they're demolishing our street, and they're repaving our street. Now, so there are two questions to this. What actually is the meaning of street? And which bit is getting demolished and which bit is getting repaved? Exactly. So you have this entire, because we have this world knowledge. This is, and I'll give you the term now, this is the frame we need. We need to have some background knowledge, some world knowledge that we bring into dealing with utterances. So if I have the word street, it's not just a specific element of it, it's the whole background knowledge. So we understand that there is some kind of flat surface, that there's something to the left and to the right of it where people live. There are probably cars. Streets also have names. All these things we know about street. That's my frame, street. But then if I say they're demolishing our street, I'm only putting one element into the foreground. I'm foregrounding the houses in the street. And if I say they're repaving our street, I still have the same meaning of street. It's still this entire thing. But of this frame street, I'm only highlighting the bit on the surface, on the floor. So the pavement, the concrete, or whatever. And the same, of course, goes for he washed the car, he vacuumed the car, and he filled up the car. I don't need to tell you that he probably washed the outside, he probably vacuumed the inside, and he hopefully filled up the tank and not the interior of the car. I do not need to specify that, because you understand the word car. You have background knowledge of the concept car, and the frame car that you have in your mind, this background knowledge, lets you, due to the construction and the lexical items in it, foreground the element that's salient here. Okay, so this is this notion of foregrounding in frames. Frames is the background knowledge, and that provides more than just the denotation, more than just what we learn as, these descriptive elements. So it's the thing with the four wheels and the, that moves from A to B, but also connotations. So it's encyclopedic long-term knowledge that brings in all our experiences that we have, and frames are also dependent on culture and on people. So it's my personal experience that lets me know certain things but not other things. So that determines my frame. It becomes very clear with words, for example, like knuckle. If you had the word knuckle in a text and there was a child asking you, hey, what's a knuckle? How would you describe knuckle? How would you explain knuckle to that kid? Exactly. It's where two parts of your fingers join. It is impossible to describe the word knuckle without finger, right? It only exists if there's a finger. I mean, quoting Gilmore Girls again, but there's a great scene about them discussing the fact that, well, I have a lap, but it's not really there. It only exists when I'm sitting. So it has to do with my thighs, but it's not really there. It only exists the minute I sit down, and then it seems to disappear. So you cannot describe the word lap without the concept of sitting. So it's these frames that we need. So for knuckle, you need the frame of finger. For lap, you need the frame of sitting, and you need the concept of size in order to understand it. And when you get into wicket and cricket and things like that, it gets even clearer that one only makes sense within the concept of the other. You need already a shared background knowledge. So different parts of the frame can be foregrounded, like we did with street. You can also say, if I say, okay, wheel, well, that is sort of the basic idea of a wheel, but I can also talk about a hub, I can talk about a spoke, I can talk about the rim, and they only make sense within the frame of wheel. So what those lexical items would be doing is foregrounding elements of the frame. And I can not only do that lexically, I can do that with constructions. Certain constructions foreground certain elements of, lexical items in this case. And we already said cognitive grammar allows for fuzzy, non-discrete categories on all levels. And you've learned a bit about prototype theory already in semantics, and cognitive grammar would definitely adhere to that notion that word meaning, but also not only lexical word meanings, but also grammatical word meaning and also the meaning of constructions are organized around prototypes, best examples, and then you have networks of less good examples for some reason or other, and you can have sort of strings of developments, but they're all related in a way. So my one meaning that I have in my head is what would be called a Gestalt, so the sort of German word philosoph that made it into philosophy and cognitive grammar. This overall shape notion, that is the meaning. And within this shape notion there is a prototype, or a couple of prototypes even that are closely linked together, but you certainly need some overall meaning for the entire construction that is called the Gestalt. And what determines the prototypes and why some things are more evident than others, well, that is often attributed to frequency. And this ties in, of course, with neuroscience, this idea that if the same synapses fire together a lot, then they get strengthened, the myelin layer around them gets strengthened, these connections get strengthened, and you get that more readily, more often. And then there are others that also fire, and we can make use of them because the paths are there, but they're not that readily available, they're less prototypical. And the way Langacker draws that is, he calls it the peaks and valleys phenomenon. So the idea that, let's take the word chest again. So most instances that we get for chest are nouns. And then sometimes I get he chested his way through the crowd, and that's a verb. And maybe chest as a verb I get a couple of times, but I could also say, well, I don't know, it's sort of, I don't like this mouse, it's so chesty, sort of. Then I could also get it as an adjective, probably even rarer. And then sometimes I get things in between. And what I get is this idea of peaks and valleys. So it's probably a noun, it can be used as a verb, sometimes I have an adjective, and this whole thing gives me chest. And this is very similar to this idea of neurons firing often together, rarely, and even less so. But there is a connection between them, which also is accounted for in psychological studies and psycholinguistic studies on mistakes in language production, for example, where I do mix up one phoneme with another or one word with another, because even if they're completely unrelated, they do connect. And that's also how many word riddles and games work, that if I talk about a bank, the money institution, the riverbank is sort of activated as well. Although it's the prototypical one I'm talking about, you get a little bit of this that's activated with it. They are connected, and thus you have sort of a grid of something strongly connected and less so, and connections in between, and that's part of my gestalt of the word. Okay, I'm talking too much today. And I've killed my thing. Okay. All right. And this brings us, so we said fuzziness, and we said fuzziness is true for all the different categories, no matter if they're concrete or abstract. Yeah. Spatial meaning, yes. So spatial relations, that's one of the basic cognitive abilities that we acquire. They're acquired very early in life, and they're very embodied experience. A lot of cognitive grammarians work with this idea of embodiment, that we as people experience something often on our body, like placement before or behind, or this classic peekaboo game with children who at some point realize that there is a space behind the cloth and that's where mommy is. So it's a very physical experience. It's a very concrete thing. We learn it early, and we use this for structuring more complex, more difficult, more abstract things. And this is one of the reasons why cognitive grammarians are so interested in spatial meaning and spatial prepositions, because the idea is that we work via analogy, so our experiences regarding space, which we encode into language, structure our conceptualizations of more abstract things. So if we study this more concrete thing, we can also draw conclusions about more abstract things. In English, one and the same spatial proposition can be used to describe different kinds of relations between things. So we get to this concept of polysemy, but we often ask ourselves, so how many meanings do we distinguish then? And what do they share? And are some then more central or others? How do we decide what the prototype is? And then how do we describe this prototype? So if I look at this list of sentences, I can say, okay, the cat is in the house, or the cat in the house. This would probably be pretty prototypical, right? More prototypical maybe than the bird in the garden or the flowers in the vase. Why? What would you say makes one possibly more prototypical than 2 or 3? Yeah. Location, a more prototypical location, I'm not 100% sure of, but in a way, at least in the sense that it's a more definite location, right? A house sort of has these clear boundaries. This is the house, and here is outside the house. Where a garden, unless it has a very strict fence, doesn't necessarily have these boundaries, and especially what it lacks is this bit, the top part, right? It's open there. So if we say, okay, the cat is in the house, we have a container that fully encloses, so this is my landmark container then, that fully encloses the trajector cat. Whereas with the bird in the garden, this goes. So I don't have a container with 6 clear boundary surfaces or boundary planes anymore. Now, what happens with flowers in the vase? How many clear sort of boundaries? Do I have clear boundaries? It tells you where the flowers are. So I have my landmark that has at least sort of on many sides clear boundaries. But then this is my flower in the vase, right? Which bit of the flower is actually in my vase? Just a little bit, right? And not even probably the most salient part of flower. Because when we think of flower, we'll usually think of the blossom and not of the bit of the stem that's in the vase, right? So this relationship between the trajector that we said prototypically is fully enclosed in a landmark with clear boundaries doesn't apply to that extent here. So it's a less prototypical example than we would say. And the same we can say for the bird in the tree, like where are my clear boundaries for the tree? Or the chair in the corner. A corner doesn't really function as a container. I mean, where does it even end? The water in the vase then again makes a lot of sense, but the crack in the vase? Where in is it actually? It's, I mean, obviously not in here. And then we get to the very interesting things, like we have the stirrup, and we have something like that, a foot in the stirrup. And then let's say we also have a finger and the ring. Now, in a way, they're very similar, aren't they? So you have this little bit of the foot that's actually in the stirrup. And you have the little bit of the finger that's actually in the ring. But do we say the finger in the ring? Usually not, right? We would talk about a ring on the finger. And this maybe is a bit of an example for this. Now, the relationship of ring and finger is different, because here, it's the leg that gets supported by the stirrup, but it's not the finger that gets supported by the ring. I would say my arm in a cast, but I wouldn't say my finger in a ring, because it's actually the ring that is supported by the finger. And on has this extended meaning of support. I can say the chalk is on the table, and one thing is directionality and location, but another part of it is also that the table carries the chalk, holds it. And this notion of support then transfers to the ring on the finger. So this is this idea of more prototypical core meanings, like for in, as we said, location, trajectory is fully contained within the landmark with clear physical boundaries on all sides as a prototype. And on trajectory is above the landmark, but classically I have physical contact, right? And the prototype has this landmark supporting the trajectory, and they're two separate entities. Now what they actually then do often depends on context. Yeah, I think I'll skip around, but the idea is the same. That the prototype of a round would be I have a landmark that has clear boundaries, and if I go around it, I fully circle it. Like I walk around the lake, but I can also walk around sort of the garden, or I can walk around the puddle where I only like travel along part of the trajectory. And let's make a difference here. The trajectory is the movable entity. The trajectory is the path along which it travels. So here, my trajectory circles the landmark because my trajectory circles it along the trajectory. But here I only do part of it if I walk around the puddle. Unless it's kids hopping around the puddle, but it's a different thing. And I can even say somebody runs around in the garden, or I can even just say run around. And I hope you can see how sort of from this prototypical use I can get meaning extensions that gradually move away from the prototype. And yeah, I'll just get to this bit. What you then get is this sort of gestalt, this sort of meaning network of one meaning, that's the prototype, and many meaning extensions. And what's important to remember is that all of them are the meaning of the word. Because what we have in our minds is how this construction, in this case one preposition, has been used in different ways. And all of them are entrenched in our mind. So we carry all that with us, but some things are more strongly activated as others because they're more frequent, more prototypical, etc. Learning them earlier also is part of prototype formation, or is often said to be part of prototype formation. Yeah. And we can go beyond the literal meaning then into meaning extensions. And this is where metaphor study comes in. Mostly Lakoff and Johnson, they were sort of the founding fathers, but goes beyond them. So the idea is that I can, if we work by analogy, as we said, do that for other things as well. So have a more concrete experience, like the spatial prepositions we talked about. That's my source domain. I start with something that we know well, that we share. And then I can take elements from that and transfer them into something less concrete. And one of the classic ones would be space for time. Because space is something that has a strong embodiment notion, something we can easily imagine, we can easily conceptualize and perspectivize, whereas time is tricky. And we often use words that are classically words for space in order to conceptualize time. And that, of course, this use of space for time makes us conceptualize in time in this sort of spatial way as a linear fashion, in a linear fashion. That this happens before that, and then this happens after it. And this terrible day is behind me, but tomorrow's grading is still sort of in front of me, right? So the idea is that language and conceptualization also work together. How we use language represents our conceptualization, but the fact that we use language that way also strengthens this kind of conceptualization, thus creating new conceptualizations. But as I said, you cannot only do that for space and time. It works with anything where you want to talk about something abstract, and it's tricky to sort of pin it down, so you would rather use something from a domain that is more concrete, more familiar. Like intimacy, that's difficult to express. We often construe in terms of heat, for example. Heat being a very physical, embodied experience. And I can say, well, I couldn't quite warm to her, or she's such a cold person, she gave me a really icy look. Or spatially, with distance, I felt close to him, or I found his manner distant, and he's quite unapproachable. So you can see how these spatial relations and embodied ideas of heat and warmth can be used to use more abstract notions. So you have non-spatial meanings for prepositions as well. And that would be the metaphorical use then. So you see one thing in terms of another, which is a cognitive strategy of making sense of the world, but also for creating shared categories of something that is so abstract that otherwise we wouldn't really be able to talk about them, would we? So we need something to hold on to, something concrete. And metaphor is definitely not something that you only do in your literature studies. Metaphor is all-pervasive, and once you start looking for it, you realize how little of what we say is actually what we would say the literal meaning of something. Yes? So from the spatial domain, I can go into the temporal, the emotional, the interactional, the organizational domain, and many others. And it's, of course, not only space that we use. We can use all kinds of domains, but you go from the concrete to the abstract. So let's then return to our example of in, where we said, okay, trajectory fully contained in the landmark. I can also use that, of course, temporal. It happened in June. So June is my container. And I have a trajectory in there, so my landmark, and I have a trajectory, and it happened in June. Now, as metaphors go, it's a metaphor that I built from the prototype. But I can also sort of extend from that. I can say, oh, I'm very fast, I can actually do that in 5 minutes. Then I'm still within the landmark 5 minutes. But the trajectory is not this one thing, but it sort of fills the 5 minutes all the way. But I can also say I'll be there in an hour, and then from this frame, the container that we have, I only foreground the end point. I'm only interested in 2 hours, so I have this span, but only this bit is foregrounded, only this bit is highlighted. But I can also use this for, like, take the domain of space and apply this metaphor and like sort of apply this to the domain of emotion or condition, like John is in love. So what we conceptualize is sort of something, a bubble of, I don't know, pink liquid or whatever you want to conceptualize that John is in. And he's encompassed by that to an extent. But Sam can also be in debt, or Sue can be in trouble. So you have these conditions and states that somebody is in, and it's a similar imagery. Yeah, and that works with over and with many other prepositions. What I want to definitely point out to you at this point is that when you write your exam, if you have a question on this, and you're asked to describe the meaning difference between, for example, the cat is in the house and John is in love. If you tell me, okay, well, John is not literally in a love, but the cat is really in the house, then you have shown me that you understand the English language, and I'm very glad that you do, but this is not an application of cognitive grammar theory. If you want to apply cognitive grammar theory, then you need to use their terminology to talk about a prototype. And what is the prototype? Okay, I have a landmark, and the landmark has clear boundaries, and the trajectory is a small entity that is completely sort of enclosed by that container, and then from this spatial domain I can have a metaphorical extension into an emotional domain, okay? That is cognitive grammar. And the other thing is I understand English, which is also very important and very good, but not an application of cognitive grammar theory. So please keep that in mind when studying. Cognitive grammar seems very obvious when you look at it like that. It's like, duh, yeah, of course, these are the differences and this how they're related. But what you have to be aware of is that this hadn't been studied before. This had not been part of how we structure the lexicon. There's a meaning of in, that's my list entry, this is in, and then there's my rules, what I can do within, and that's how I generate a sandwich. I have a problem with sentence and sandwich. Okay, that's how I generate my sentence. This is what Langacker called the rules list fallacy. A fallacy meaning something that sort of is a wrong way of thinking, a mistaken way of thinking. That we have these lists of words and the rules of how we can use them in a sentence, and this is what we do. So this is really a new description of language. It just means it might seem very obvious to you if you feel that language is actually indeed structured that way, and that it's interesting to describe that. Now, language is never quite clear-cut. I can, for example, say, well, the sun is out, and the lights are out. And a very salient element of this sentence is actually contradictory here, right? So one has I have shining, and the other one I have not shining. Now, what I could say here is that it depends very much on what sort of where, what goes when, how I place myself. I could say the sun is out, so it sort of goes out of this container of the clouds, but the lights are out, so they're sort of out of the container I am in right now. So I'm in this room, and there's no light. So the lights are out. And the same I could say for the book is out, so the container would then be, I don't know, the publishing house, and then the book is out. But if John is out, then John is also out of the house. And nevertheless, John is out means that he's not available, whereas the book is out, it's a question of then he is available. So conceptualizations can do different things there. Some can be spatial, some can be an issue of saliency. So meaning is somewhere in between there, but it has to do with how I conceptualize it. And then, of course, you have some form meaning pairings that are tricky for grammarians because they're regionally different, like you fill in a form or you fill out a form. Seems contradictory, but as we said, if I study a variety, I can only ever study that variety, and I sort of say synchronically, this is what I'm studying, but I'm of course aware of the fact that there's diachronic change, there's regional variety, and they influence each other. But the importance is that cognitive grammar would say that it's a question of what perspective I take. Often it's a question of a relationship between a landmark and a trajectory, and often it's a question of me having a frame of something in my mind, and I foreground certain elements that then interact with other elements in my sentence, and that's the element I conceptualize as being the participant, but that doesn't mean the meaning has changed, it just means I've foregrounded a different element. And I always start with a situation in my mind that I want to describe, and I choose certain things as salient, and the construction I choose is the one that can encompass the salient elements and convey the meaning, and then I fill it with the lexical elements that go. Yeah, what's important is that this meaning extension also works not only for lexical elements, but also for grammaticals, like, for example, past tense. So we can say, I went home. But I can also use the past tense if I say, oh, if I were you, I would do this and that. If I were you doesn't mean if I were you yesterday, it means right now. But I can also use the past tense for politeness reasons. I can say, would you have some coffee? Or would you mind? So would you rather use this kind of form? Or Could I ask you a question? Or no, I'm not thinking of good examples, but I'm sure I have some on my slides. Yeah, could you help me? I wanted to ask you something. That's a very nice one. That still means I want to ask you now, but I'm saying wanted. And cognitive grammarians would say, well, these are equally related. So the prototype of ED is something that I construe as temporally behind me in the past. But behind me also implies a certain kind of distance. And this notion of distance can be extended to social distance. I'm politer to people to whom I'm more distant, right? But also in terms of if I had enough time, distance in reality, like if it's in the past, then I cannot change it right now. And if I were you, that's also something that I cannot change it right now. So this non-real condition that is then metaphorically extended to politeness and to counterfactuality. So this is not limited to lexical items, but we said in cognitive grammar there is no clear lexicon grammar distinction. So something that applies to one also has to apply to the other. Yeah. Cognitive paradigm, meaning is conceptual. Linguistic structure reflects cognition. Words and grammar are meaningful. I hope that's clear. And also that there are things like construal, how do I see the world? Perspective, where do I position myself? Frame, my world knowledge, and then I have foreground and element. Categories are fuzzy, and there's metaphorical extension from concrete source domains to more abstract target domains. Spatial meanings are embodied. They have a polysemous relationship between different meanings. And I'm saying meanings, what I really mean is there's one meaning and there's different senses. There's different instantiations. And there are meaning extensions. That's the metaphors. New meaning, change of domain. Yeah, there's a review chapter on this on Moodle, which I strongly recommend reading. And for next week, for psycholinguistics, there's a section in blog and a section in uniw for you to read up on. And let me just remind you of this issue to cover in the review session Moodle forum. Please use it so we can prepare our last session well. Thank you for your patience, everyone.